I would say my experience, this may be wrong, but is a combination of this dude's fucking crazy and I wish I was doing what he was doing.
I love that. Yeah, I feel like that's the case with most crazy people or people that we deem as crazy. There's this there's a sense of freedom or just being untethered to certain narratives and social conditioning that's scary and enticing at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, was there some turmoil within you as far as holy shit, I feel burnt out. This is not exactly what I want to be doing, but it's going really well. Obviously, it seems like it was probably pretty promising for, making money and, just being a successful entrepreneur.
I would say what really allowed me to leave.
All right, Rising Man crew. Got one of my dear brothers on the call today, Jeremy Richardson. Jeremy, how you doing today, man?
Doing really well. How about yourself?
I am doing great. Sometimes I wish I was where you are over there in Hawaii, nice and warm. Instead, I'm in Lake Tahoe, which is very beautiful, but it was like 12 degrees today. I was shoveling snow and hands were getting all cold. And I was just thinking about you being warm and toasty, looking at the ocean over there.
Yeah, it was a little chilly this morning. It was around 70 or so. So, it's a tough life. Someone's got to live it.
Someone's got to do it. Awesome, man. Well, I'm really grateful that you said yes to the invitation to be on here. You are someone I have thought of being on this segment, being on Fam Life. As I told you, it's all about relationship, lifestyle, and amplifying the voices of people of color. And you're a man of color that I respect deeply. I think you have such a well-rounded story and you're just a well-rounded man. And in our friendship, we're just able to talk about everything because you can go all places. So let's just kick it off. Kind of little intro, little life story. Just let us know who you are, man.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the intro. I definitely appreciate you inviting me on. Definitely feels like an honor to be on the podcast. So, yep. My name's Jeremy. I was born and raised in Wisconsin, grew up in Milwaukee and Kenosha County. Went to college in Boston at MIT, graduated there with a degree in mechanical engineering, and basically got out to California as soon as I could because I really love it out there and mostly love not having snow. So got to California and very quickly got into the tech startup scene out there. And at 23, co-founded a company called Womply. It was a software startup and was definitely blessed to have found something that through a lot of hard work over about 5 years, we grew from two of us to about 100 employees, about $20 million raised in venture capital. And we were growing faster than ever. It was 2015, but I actually started having my first spiritual awakening, I would say, around that time too. And combination of burnout, working 80 to 100 hours a week for 4 years straight, pretty much, coupled with my spiritual awakening, led me to leaving the company, even though we were growing faster than ever, and on a really, accelerated trajectory. And that's when I would say my life really started to take off in a really more interesting way and deeper way. With the spiritual awakening comes a lot of healing, uncovering trauma that I didn't even know was there, on all areas of my life. But also that spaciousness, leaving the kind of structured work world also helped me rediscover my artistic side. So I got more into art. I built a 20-foot tall sculpture, brought to Burning Man, started making laser cut sacred geometry mandalas, which I still do today, called activated art. That period is also when I met my now wife, Gigi. And, we've been together for 7 years now. So I'm sure we'll probably dive into some relationship stuff on this conversation. And I basically wanted to, create my own way. So we got into coaching, started a coaching business that burned out and failed, which we can or cannot go into. But it was a really tough time in my life because I really didn't want to have to get a job that I hated. which are most jobs for me. But we were running out of money. And so I had to kind of bite the bullet and figure out how to get back into the workforce after taking 3 years off of not working, which was a kind of a sabbatical that I'm really grateful for. And I grew a lot. But after that, at that point, I had to get back into the startup world. So I was a VP of product at 2 different startups over the course of about 3 years. That's when COVID hit. And, in all of the kind of obviously, bad aspects of COVID, has been a blessing for us in certain ways, in the sense of with remote work. My wife and I were finally able to move to Hawaii because that was a dream we had since 2018. We just didn't know how we were going to get here. But because of COVID, remote working, we were like, let's go. We're kind of done with California, the Bay Area. So we moved here to the Big Island, Hawaii, about almost 2 years ago now. And I was still working at the last job I had at that point, but kind of circling back, the startup that I co-founded that I left in 2015, they were still growing, and my co-founder and president and everyone was still running the company. And just last year, they had an exit. I can't give the details, but it was very successful in a life-changing kind of way. And so that in the past year or so really opened up doors, kind of really a new life for me and my wife, which we're really, really blessed to have experience and to have. And so now we're here in Hawaii in the Big Island, and just living our lives now.
Yeah, man, that's a pretty incredible story. And there's so many themes and different aspects in there. So would love to dive into it a bit more and just unpack it a bit more. Let's start with college and transitioning into co-founding a company at 23. What was that? MIT is a pretty good school from what I've heard.
Not bad.
So was that, I guess, was it always part of your plan to go to college? Did you dream of going to MIT? What was kind of that process for you?
That's a good question. That's interesting. I never think about that much. So I would say I have my mom primarily to thank for nudging me to go to MIT. I actually remember when I was probably 12 or so. So my brother is 6 years older than me. He's also mechanical engineering mind. And I remember actually when he was looking at colleges, we went to MIT, me, him, and my dad went to MIT together. So I must have been 12 at that time. And he wanted to stay closer to home. So he ended up going to school in Michigan, but that was, I guess the seed was kind of planted. I remember being on the campus when I was 12 or so, but interestingly, I was always had good grades. I did well in school, as I feel blessed to have been born with the ability to excel at school pretty naturally. I know not everyone has that. So I've always been grateful for that. But even though I didn't really think about college much in high school, I got good grades, but I didn't really think much about the future. What I knew was I wanted to be very successful and some kind of entrepreneur. I would say that was instilled in me by the media, seeing all the business moguls, Steve Jobs, et cetera, be so successful. But I didn't really think about how to get there. But yeah, around junior year, my mom was like, I want you to go to MIT. And so I was like, okay. And, senior year, we started the application process. And I had a lot of help from her, from my guidance counselor, mostly because I wasn't the best writer. So I needed help on the kind of verbal written aspects of the application and SAT and that kind of thing. But yeah, I feel blessed to have gotten into MIT early. My other option was going to apply to Caltech, but it was December 31st. The deadline to apply to Caltech was like 20 minutes away. And I was like, I'd already gotten into MIT. And I was like, I'm just going to go to MIT. I think that's a good choice. I don't feel like applying to Caltech. So I'm going to go that way.
Awesome, man. That pretty cool how, you see it when you're 12, right? And then you, and it ends up being the school that you go to. I also really like that there was kind of always this sense of a entrepreneurial spirit within you. And, we talk about vision a lot at Rising Man. So it sounded like you kind of, even though it wasn't this clear picture of what it was going to look like, there was always like some sort of knowing that you wanted to take an endeavor into, being an entrepreneur.
Yeah, like dream big was kind of my mantra. I wouldn't call it that in high school, but that's what I would, in my, instant messenger, remember the AIM days in your profile thing? Like I would always have dream big in there in high school, and something in me just knew that I really I'm passionate about kind of pushing my own boundaries and doing things in kind of unorthodox kind of way. And I've always felt this potential inside of me, and I've always had a really strong desire to fulfill it, as much as I can. I remember, so on the racial side, I grew up in Wisconsin, Silver Lake, Wisconsin. It was 2,000 person town. We were the only Black family in the entire town. I was the only Black kid in my school growing up. High school, we moved to a bigger city, so there were more people of color, but still, the racial aspects was there. And when I first showed one of my teachers when I first told them I wanted to apply to MIT, she flat out told me she didn't think I have what it takes. Wow. This is a teacher telling me that. And I took it, I was like, okay. And I just walked away. Obviously I didn't use her as a recommendation, but no, that kind of experience like motivates me. I'm like, I'll show you, that kind of thing. I remember when I showed my guidance counselor, I showed him the MIT application letter, and I watched in real time him go from like this kind of crazy, holy shit, I can't believe that you're even thinking about that, to like, okay, let's do this. That was the kind of support that I really obviously needed and was really grateful to have, not the other kind of, reaction. But yeah, something in me just like, I knew I've had this potential and I knew I wanted to fulfill it. And I feel grateful to have had the confidence to be able to go after my dreams in spite of, challenges, which we all have in lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's very apparent even in just the brief life recap that you gave at the top of this episode here. And dream big. I can definitely see that being really a context that you carry and that I've seen in you since we first met. Do you think, where do you think that came from? Do you think this is something that's just innate, you were born with, a gift, skill, just part of the cloth that you're cut from? Do you feel like that was something that was curated by your parents? Yeah. Where do you think that essence comes from?
That's a really good question. I would say it's a combination. I definitely feel like there's this inherent, it feels in me, like innate. But I definitely, my mom, when I was a kid, she would take us around Whitefish Bay, which is like the uppity part of Milwaukee, like right along Lake Michigan, these big mansions, and she would just drive us around that neighborhood to look at these huge houses when I was a kid. And like that still stands out, as the feeling of I could have this, or I could create this, that she was instilling in us as children and me as children. My dad, he was an entrepreneur all of his life, and unfortunately not always successful, which I learned a lot from and actually motivated me to be successful. Sometimes the pain is what motivates us to be successful, right? But still, in spite of his challenges, which he had many challenges in various ways, he never gave up. He always had grit. He always worked really hard, and I saw that. And so I would say it's a combination of, I was born with it, but I feel like my parents definitely played a strong role in helping me see beyond my circumstance for myself too.
Incredible. Yeah, I think when you ask someone why they are the way they are, some of it is intrinsic, some of it is extrinsic, but I always find it's helpful to reflect back on it. And, for people that are listening to this, especially young guys that are maybe, college age, about to enter college or just out of college, I think that the audacity to dream big is something we all want. And I know for myself, it's something that scares the shit out of me a lot, and like, who am I to give myself the permission to think that I can actually achieve that, so when we see a man that's able to do it authentically, which I think you do extremely well, I always love to learn more about it. Like, where does it come from? How do I curate that more myself? And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more, especially when we talk about your spiritual awakening and all that. So awesome. You go to MIT and then you co-found the startup. Now, is this something, was that right after school? Did you work for someone first? Or did you just like, nah, I'm not doing that?
So I left. This is a funny part of the story, but it was, so I get to California, and I actually get a job doing mechanical engineering at first. That was my degree. That's what I knew. And I got my number 2 choice as far as companies I wanted to work for. So I was happy about that. But very quickly, I only lasted 7 months, man. It felt so soul sucking to work at this. I mean, it was a nice product design firm. It was like what I thought I wanted to do, but it was just like, I didn't have any passion for it. And in the meantime, I was just kind of running around the Bay Area, meeting people, making friends, kind of like having fun as a 22-year-old does. And I was able to, meet people that were in the kind of the Silicon Valley software startup space. And especially through my MIT connections, right? There's a lot of people from MIT out there in that space. And so within 7 months of moving to California, getting a kind of engineering job, I would say this was the scariest decision I ever made in my life so far. I knew a founder of a startup. It's very small, 2 people working out of an apartment in Mountain View, California. And it's called Mixpanel. They're pretty successful now. And the founder, he approached me, and we gotten to know each other. We were friends. And he was like, I want you to come do BD for me. I was like, what's BD? It's business development, which people know now. I know now, but it's a standard term. And so he knew that I was kind of hungry, that I was kind of a go-getter. And, it was an experiment for him because he was like kind of testing what kind of roles would fit for his company. But I was, 22, mechanical engineer, no sales experience or anything in my life, and approached with this opportunity to lead essentially sales for a very small startup. And I remember sitting at my computer, looking at my roommate, and I was like, I think I'm going to do this. And it was terrifying. Like, I had no idea what I was doing, but I had this feeling that it was the right thing to do. And it was exciting. And it was an opportunity to help build a company. And that's really what excited me. So the next day I left, I gave my notice at my engineering job. And it's funny, I think I've quit 1, 2, 3 jobs now. And it's like quitting my job has always been like the most beautiful days of my life. Because I've always done it with something.
Weight off your shoulders.
Yeah. And like to pursue something I'm really passionate about. Right. So I got into the startup, like software startup scene at Mixpanel. That actually wasn't the right role for me. I lasted 4 months, but it wasn't working. So we parted ways. And then my brother he went to Stanford for grad school. So he was out there too in Palo Alto. So I was crashing on his floor for about 9 months, collecting unemployment, fortunately, which I realized I could do because I got fired from the previous job. And in that 9 months, my goal was to either start a company or find a company a startup to work at, like a really early stage. And so I would say I was blessed, to be able to have my brother's floor. Literally, I was sleeping on a yoga mat for 9 months, super low budget, balling on a budget, I used to call it. And you're just trying to find my way. And eventually I met a guy. I was on this kind of internet forum, and there's a question, what startups are hiring salespeople? And there's an answer, this guy named Toby, and he said, we're hiring salespeople. So I just emailed him, say, here's some of my background, let's talk. We met at a cafe in Palo Alto, and I just had a feeling, like I had a really strong feeling that was going to turn into something. And it was actually a company that didn't come to fruition at that point. But I think that's kind of an undercurrent or a theme of my life, is having a really strong feeling that something, even though it's scary or irrational, feels like the right move for me. And I had that feeling. So I just knew something about it. And so it wasn't until maybe 5 months later that we actually started working together. In the meantime, I went to Europe, couch surfing for 2 months, just like having fun. And when I was there, we had a phone call, me and Toby, my now co-founder, and he's like, hey, that original idea, I had a dream and it morphed into something else. Do you want to come work on it with me? And I was like, yeah. So I booked a ticket, came back from Europe, and we started working on Womply in sometime in 2011, like early 2011. And so Womply, that's the company that I co-founded. I was 23 at that time. That became the successful one.
Wow. So there's something is coming up for me, and it's failure. right? And the question is like, what's your relationship to failure? Because in this story you're telling, there's several different parts that I think many people might consider a failure at a certain point. Or, you know, for example, if I was in that position and got a job after school and I felt like it just wasn't for me and wasn't motivated, was feeling drained from it, I might feel like that was a failure, right? And then this other thing that, you know, BD 5 months didn't work out, might consider that a failure, right? And you know, how we all bounce back from failure is, you know, unique to each and every one of us, but that word didn't come out of your mouth at all. And I guess curious if in those times, in those moments, did you ever consider them failures? And just throughout life in general, what would you say your relationship is to failure?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to bring up. So I did feel like I was failing because I was literally failing at the startup Mixpanel because I wasn't making sales. You know, I was taking action, getting meetings with these big companies, you know, with executives as a 22-year-old. I was taking action, but I wasn't producing results. So in that sense, I was literally failing, but emotionally, I didn't lose context. I had no experience. I didn't know what I was doing, you know, and I knew that, but I was still trying. And so I think in that sense, I wasn't like down on myself, even though I was actually failing. But kind of a deeper level for me, you know, the engineering job that I really didn't enjoy, but I was, you know, showing up every day. When I look at it, when I find myself in a situation that I prefer not to be in, but I have to be in for whatever, that's just some circumstance I'm in. What I've always done is figured out what actions I can take that are aligned with where I want to be. And for me, if I know that I have some kind of plan, I'm taking some actions that are aligned with where I want to be, even though for the time being, I'm in a situation that isn't ideal, then I still feel like I'm making progress. Does that make sense? So in that, like, if I was just twiddling my thumbs, not meeting anyone, working at the engineering job, you know, going out, drinking every day, going to dinner, if I wasn't actually doing things outside of work that I felt like moved me forward, then I would be depressed. Then I'd feel like something's wrong. But I always had just the drive to kind of have at least some level of clarity of like, this is what I want, and these are some actions I can take within my current circumstances to get there. And I think as long as I can take those actions, I feel alive.
Yeah. To me, the word integrity really comes up, and it's like, you know, at the end of the day, can I look at myself in the mirror and say, I did everything that I could to the best of my abilities. And if you can say yes to that, doesn't matter what the outcome is, right? Because there's nothing left to wonder. There's no what ifs. There's no, I should have really tried this instead. You can look yourself in the mirror and be like, I did everything that I could. Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. If I lay it out on the table, I have absolutely nothing to regret. Like, I did my best.
Yeah, I love that. So now looking at the startup, transition from startup to spiritual awakening. What was that? What'd that look like?
Yeah. So my first time going to Burning Man was that 9-month stretch before the startup. And right after I got fired from Mixpanel, I packed everything I owned in my car. And like 2 weeks later, I got a ticket to Burning Man and just drove there. And that was 2010. And then we started the company. So I didn't go to Burning Man at all for 4 years or so. But then around year 4, I got kind of like the feeling that it was time to go back. So I went back to Burning Man in 2014, and just kind of synchronistically, I didn't have any plans to do. I didn't do any drugs or smoke or anything all up until this point in my life. Like, I was pretty, you know, straight edge in that sense. But in 2014 at Burning Man, I had the opportunity to do LSD for the first time. And that actually is what opened my eyes to, the way I would describe it is, like, for the first time in my life, I sensed that there was something more to the material world. Like, all up until this point, I never really had an experience or question like the materiality of this world. Like, there was no kind of spiritual essence in my conscious awareness. But that actually opened my mind. I was like curiosity is the word that comes to mind. It's like, it made me curious about what more there is to life than like everything I've been focusing on. And then, so like that kind of opened the door was LSD. But then what really kind of started grounding it was I went to my first Vipassana meditation retreat shortly after that. And, Vipassana meditation retreats are 10 days, 10 hours a day of meditation, where for the entire 10 days, you don't talk to anyone else. You don't even look at anyone else. You keep your eyes on the ground when you walk around. And it's a really intense. And that's how I got into meditation. That's kind of a theme of mine. I kind of jump into things that because it felt right. Something in me was like, this is for you, And so when I started meditating, I did the Vipassana retreat, that really opened my eyes to wanting to stop drinking and really just like be more healthy, take care of myself. And I was pretty healthy, but like just like another level. Right. And so, yeah, that kind of like wanting to sit every day, meditate every day. And, I would still do the psychedelics. They were really helpful in continuing to kind of expand my awareness and my horizons in that sense. But yeah, when I started being curious about what more there was to life, I became less and less interested in working at my company. Even though we had just hit that inflection point and we were growing really fast, had 100 employees. But I thought after my first Vipassana that I would last another year or two. But within 7 months, I was gone. I left the company within 7 months. It just kept the desire to leave kept accelerating and like growing in me. And so, I left on very good terms, but within halfway through that year, 2015, I was gone and I had no plans. I literally wrote an email to the company, kind of just saying goodbye. And I ended it with like, I have no plans other than to flow and see where life takes me. And that's what I did.
Did they think you were fucking crazy?
I would say my experience is maybe wrong, but is a combination of this dude's fucking crazy and I wish I was doing what he was doing.
I love that. Yeah, I feel like that's the case with most crazy people or people who are deemed as crazy. There's this like, there's a sense of freedom or just being untethered to certain narratives and social conditioning that's scary and enticing at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, was there some turmoil within you as far as like, holy shit, I feel burnt out. This is not exactly what I want to be doing, but it's going really well. Obviously, it seems like it was probably pretty promising for, making money and, just being a successful entrepreneur.
I would say what really allowed me to leave was that I really felt complete with my contribution to the company. Like that, and that comes back to the integrity piece. Like if I didn't feel like I was complete in my contribution, I would have stuck it out. But we were almost 5 years in. I had worked my ass off. I literally I done the math. I worked 9 years of 40-hour work weeks in those 4.5 years or 5 years I was there, So like I felt really good about my contribution and I felt really good about where the company was going and I knew that they didn't need me anymore. And so that coupled with the fact that I was truly burnt out and my just general interests were going elsewhere, it felt really aligned to leave. Yeah. So it felt perfect actually.
Yeah. I keep hearing this coming up and you sharing, and it seems like you're really good at listening to your internal compass and following it, even if it doesn't make sense logically. There's been a couple times throughout your story where it's like, it felt right, or I just knew. Where do you think that comes from?
That's a good question. And that's something that I've had since I was a kid, like just this feeling sometimes, of like, this is right for me, even though it didn't make any sense or it was scary. And the best explanation I have for it, I think it's something innate. And if you are familiar with human design, which is a really beautiful system that kind of explains our nature and how to live based on our certain design. I'm a splenic manifester. And so I think splenic, right? Yeah. Splenic, which is kind of like instinctual. And I think it's that splenic instinctual aspect of myself that I've been in touch with my whole life. And that's what's in those really pivotal moments of big decisions to make. I think that's what's guided me. And I would say I just feel grateful that I've been able to listen, to hear that guidance. Cause it's very in the moment, like boom, it's not something that kind of lingers. It's like when the decision's happening, there's this impulse or this instinct that tells you yes or no. And that's what I've been able to kind of, that feeling, for some reason, I've been able to recognize it.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like there's a couple elements to the gut feeling, the instinct, which, I think all of us have access to. But there's being able to recognize it or hear it, right? Which is one. And then there's trusting it, right? Because you could hear it, but not act upon it because of fear of what other people are going to think, or fear that it's the wrong decision, or doesn't make sense to leave this job that's making me a lot of money and has potential to make me even more money. It doesn't make sense to leave that and then go with the flow, right? So I guess for you, and I know in my experience, like I have strong instincts, and I think for so long I didn't trust them that it got to the point where I couldn't hear them anymore. Right. It became like a very, very faint whisper. And, in the process of just being more authentically myself, that voice has gotten louder and louder. It's like, I don't know, it's hard to explain, but it's almost like that voice trusts itself to be heard. So it'll speak a little louder in the sense that it's almost like this separate entity that trusts that I will listen to it and give it validation, Curious if is that your experience with it? Have you ever had times or difficulty like actually trusting your instinct, or it's just always been, you've always had it?
I would say there's definitely times when I've made decisions that were bad, that I would say were wrong. Primarily around money, probably, basically I would say it's not like I don't have fear, fears have come up and definitely clouded my decision-making, insecurities, worthiness issues, all that kind of stuff. And so I would say, like, for the really big decisions, I have been able to find that source, the instinct, the true guidance. But there's been, I can't think of specific examples, but there's definitely moments like smaller decisions that fear has clouded my judgment, or, insecurity has clouded my judgment. Like that's definitely happened too. And that's where I would say the kind of the ongoing spiritual kind of trauma healing embodiment work has really helped me the most. Cause it's like, when I first started waking up, it was like, whoa, these big revelations, these big kind of insights, understandings about myself, about life, from my perspective. But the ongoing process of actually like embodying those teachings on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, that's like the long tail, where it's like, cleaning out the nooks and crannies, like, with a little pickaxe, like getting the little nuggets out of my system that are still kind of clouded. Yeah. If that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Yeah, I want to dive into this like spiritual awakening and kind of, I guess, working on yourself is just like what comes up for me. Maybe it's not the best way to say it, but on paper, up to this point, like you're pretty perfect, man. You went to MIT, you moved around a little bit, but you found, co-founded what is a successful startup. I would consider, and it's like, oh, what the fuck does this guy have to work on? So in that, what are some of the things that what were some of the revelations that you had, and like, oh, wow, this is a unhealed part of me, or this is a part of me that just needs to be addressed?
I would say, actually, I'm going to take it back to growing the company. So I was terrified pretty much every day of those 5 years we built that company, like either low level, just extreme insecurity, anxiety, or just, sweating bullets in meetings. Like I was in a board meeting once, and I started sweating bullets. Fortunately I wasn't speaking, so I could excuse myself to the bathroom, but I would have these anxiety attacks working in this company. I actually remember the moment when it kind of felt like my nervous system broke because I put so much pressure on myself in this one meeting, this one day, this thing that was happening. And I felt like I did feel like I was failing in that moment. And I had this kind of anxiety attack in real time where I just started sweating bullets. And since then, fortunately I've kind of grown, I've healed enough to where it doesn't really happen anymore, but pretty much almost the entire 4 years, or the last 3 or 4 years, I would say, of the company, probably like I had to structure my life around trying not to break out and have an anxiety attack. So it's like I was taking this to me, massive action in the sense of building this company with this team and everyone. But every day was a challenge to do the work while with this kind of almost overwhelming anxiety. Like it was really challenging to just show up and do the work because of my fears, my insecurities, because like I was a 20-something-year-old in Black man, that's never been, it's never, as a man of color, right? I'm sure you can relate, growing up my whole life, there's always this kind of undertone that I'm a Black man, I'm not a man, I'm a Black man in America. And like, that was with me, being in this predominantly white male, Silicon Valley tech world, I was aware of that. And so it definitely contributed to my anxiety for sure. And so on paper, yeah, it looks great and it is great, but like the day to day was definitely with challenges because I hadn't done the healing work I've done in the last, 5 to 7 years at that point.
Mm. So I guess, you touched on it a little bit, but what was underneath that anxiety?
Generally, it was, and I can speak to this now, kind of mostly being on the other side, kind of foundationally, just general insecurity, as a human being. The challenges I faced as a child, my family had financial issues. My parents got divorced when I was in 7th grade. And when I was in 4th grade, I was in a car accident that left my face scarred, which you can see here. I would say those are like the most traumatic events of my life, of my childhood. And, they left their mark. And, for the last 7 years or so that I've been on my healing journey, 7 or 8 years, those are the things that I've just come back to time and time again, more and more layers of healing the things that happened in my childhood. So I think and on the racial front, like my dad, growing up or living in Wisconsin, he experienced so much racism in the workplace, especially. He was an incredibly gifted engineer and designer and artist, yet he couldn't keep a job for too long of a period because something would come up racially, generally speaking. And even though I was a kid, as kids, we pick up on what our parents go through, right? And so I unconsciously picked up on what my dad's struggles were racially and just in general as a man trying to make it in the world. And that unconscious conditioning, I've had to reprogram in myself. I've had to heal and reprogram consciously in myself. So like those are kind of, I guess, glimpses into some of the traumas that I experienced, that I've had to, that I carried with me through my 20s and that company, and even to this day, even though I've done a lot of healing work on. Yeah.
That's incredible, man. Yeah, I can, it's crazy how much, not that you followed in your dad's footsteps, but just how much of, the man that he was is reflected in you. But, you've taken a very reflective point of view, not only to your life, but I think to your father's as well, and have really picked up some of the other missing puzzle pieces, so to say, and added them to your tool belt. And yeah, just thinking of you hear a lot like in the coaching space and the personal development of face off with these things. And I think there's a knowing that we have, for a lot of us, there's the knowing that there's something there. Maybe I know that I have this anxiety, or I know that I have these insecurities. But I think for a lot of guys, myself included, it comes to a point where it's like, well, I know that they're there, but I don't know what to do with it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, what do you have to share about that?
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase that. So it wasn't until I started waking up spiritually that I really I would say I woke up to my suffering. So it's like, I knew I was anxious, but I didn't know what to do about it the whole, when I was growing the business, until I was 26 or 7 and I had that first awakening. When I started to wake up and I started to meditate, because Vipassana is essentially, it's essentially a self-reflective embodiment practice, right? The meditation retreat I went to, like, that's where I started learning and realizing that I had the power. Well, like, I had the power to change myself, to reprogram myself, to change my conditioning. And for me, it started at the belief level where I started realizing that I had these unconscious negative beliefs about myself, like I'm not worthy, general things like that, like a lot of people have. And so when I first started my journey, I would say I started on that level of, oh, I feel insecure. How can I change that? Well, I'm going to tell myself I am secure. I am worthy. I am sacred. I deserve this. At the mental level, that's kind of how I started. Now, that's not enough to really do the full healing, but that was kind of the gateway. And so I remember there was a clear period of 2 or so years where I started to separate myself from the negative thoughts. I would say I grew in my conscious awareness enough to realize that I wasn't these feelings or I wasn't these thoughts. And so it took, meditation and the psychedelics to really expand my mental and conscious awareness to the point where I could actually separate myself from those identities or those feelings or thoughts. And I say that was the first step of, oh, I'm not that. I can see it, this negative thought that's happening in real time as I'm in this social interaction that makes me feel anxious. And I had to consciously say, that's not true. I'd be throwing a party at our house and with friends that we love. And, all these little micro interactions would make me feel so insecure or so unworthy, and it was all my stuff, but I was able to say that's not real. But the hard part is that it feels so real. It's so convincing that it's true that I had to choose to not believe it, even though it felt real. I would say that was the trick. That is the most challenging part, because in your body, in your emotions, in your nervous system, these negative thoughts and emotions feel so real, but I had to use my conscious awareness to choose to override the feeling and just choose for it not to be real. And so there is a couple year period where I was choosing things that didn't feel, I was choosing to not feel things as real that felt real. So there's like this weird dissonance. You get that, what I'm saying? Where it's extremely uncomfortable because your senses and your nervous system is telling you one thing, and you're choosing to believe another thing. But doing that for a long enough period cleared out. They just stopped. The negative thoughts just stopped happening. They just stopped. Like at some point, they just slowly faded. And now, like, I pretty much don't have any negative thoughts in the way that I used to at all.
That's really incredible. It makes me think of, I really love to rock climb. And so one of the most primal instincts that we have is fear of heights, right? And that's hardwired into us, from our ancestors and all that. And so when I first started climbing, I was very afraid of heights. So, you're climbing up and grip is just like super tense. And, there's this narrative playing that's like, I could fall to my death, right? I could fall from this large cliff rock face and fall to my death. And as you continue to climb, it's like, yes, you have evidence that you're safe. But, as you continue to climb, you keep doing more and more difficult things, lead climbing and, things that have more risk in them. But, it's a similar thing in the sense that it's like you're telling yourself that I'm not going to fall, or yes, that is a potential, but actually what I'm doing is climbing to the next checkpoint, to the next spot. And, it comes to a point where you're not thinking about the fall or your fear of heights or, 300 feet of open air underneath you, So that's like kind of the example that came up to me, in the sense that there is this weird dissonance that's happening, at least in the beginning part of the process. But at the end of the day, we're writing a new script, and to write a new script, we have to let go of that old one. And that can be pretty fucking uncomfortable. Yeah,
for sure. I think that's a good analogy. I think that feels like, it's a really good analogy. I think it's really uncomfortable, but that's what I did, is I was in real time writing new scripts for myself. I felt, someone, I would say something, someone would have a reaction, and I'd feel insecure, and I'd tell myself, no, I am secure, or no, they're not feeling the way I'm thinking they're feeling. They're fine. It's like in real time, just rewriting my script. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You bringing up the insecurity, and some of the racial conversation as well with both yourself and your dad, really made me think about how much insecurity that I had growing up. And, it's still there. I'm just a little bit better at identifying and moving through it. But I think just being a man of color in this country, it's a really common sentiment. Mm-hmm. And it's not really talked about that much, but I think there's an overall cultural narrative that there's less worth being a man of color, mm-hmm. and I think that can be nuanced in how it's portrayed. I don't think that I ever had anyone in my upbringing being like, your worth is less. You're not worth as much as, this white kid over here. Mm-hmm. But, just from pictures that we see in media, from stories, from how history is told, all these things, I think underlying deep sense of insecurity is a very, very common thing for us to feel. And I'm curious if you've ever had that conversation with other Black men mm-hmm. of color.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. I, for a little bit after Black Panther came out, I started this thing called Black King Circle, which is kind of like a men's circle for Black men. So definitely this is an important topic that I enjoy talking about. So in my experience, it's really interesting. It is largely has been like the media and America's history, how it was taught to me, and the lack of proper context that I had or didn't have, I would say, that made me susceptible to the conditioning of I am less worthy because I'm a Black man, right? The media is obvious. America's history, that's obvious, right? We all know what happened there. And so it's like, as a Black child, it's just so easy to see the overwhelming evidence out there that Black people are a certain way, worth less, white people are worth more, whatever. So it's a really subtle, unconscious conditioning that I picked up, and most of us probably pick up as children. Not to mention the direct experiences I had with racism, either through my dad or direct experiences I had growing up as a kid in high school, et cetera, because I definitely had them. I would say I'm grateful that they could have been a lot worse, but I experienced them for sure. And when I started diving into my healing work, it's when Gigi, my wife, and we started dating, of course she has that beautiful feminine intuition where she can just see something clearly that I'm like, no, it's not there. And years later, I'm like, oh, I see what you're talking about. So
she was right. Shit.
Yeah. So when we first started dating, she was like, she pointed out like I don't remember exactly how she phrased it, but basically my lack of like feelings around racial aspects, police shootings, things like that. I wouldn't really react. And I was like, if I thought I didn't have any feelings. But when I got into my healing journey, more deeply into my healing journey, and like specifically my racial and ancestral aspect of my healing journey, then I uncovered all of the racial trauma I did have in my consciousness and in my body. And that's when I started doing that work. And it was kind of coincidentally around the time that Black Panther came out, which was a really inspiring movie for me, which I really loved. Just seeing, it's crazy. Like I remember seeing this one video on Facebook when the movie came out. There was these Black guys looking at the Black Panther poster, saying like, this is what white people feel like all the time, because almost all the cast was black, like that representation. Yeah, my wife and I went to Ghana for a part of our honeymoon, and just being in a country where everyone's black, the billboards are black people everywhere. It's incredibly different than growing up in America, where it's the opposite of that. And so I do think about that, you know, when we raise our kids, how I want them to be around people of color, because it does make a difference. Representation makes a difference. My mom tells a story when he was a kid. He went up to her one day and he said, "Mommy, how come there's no successful black people?" He's a kid and he said that, you know? So it's like what we see out there to the child consciousness, adolescent consciousness, it has a big impact, because we use our out there to understand who we are as children, like, because it's an immature consciousness, right? As adults, we define ourselves internally and project that out, but it's the opposite as a kid, right? That's just how it is. And so, yeah, I experienced the same thing growing up. And so when I got into my healing journey, like I had to undo all of that unconscious programming that I had taken on, and then choose to be who I really was, choose who I really was that I wanted to be, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It makes perfect sense. Such a powerful story with your brother, man. And I think, representation is just so important. And I really love the breakdown of how as children, we kind of define ourselves, or we're defining ourselves by looking what's outside of us, where ideally, as we become adults, that starts to turn inwards. So Black King Circle, I was part of it for a little bit. And I remember to this day when you reached out to me and told me it was something that you were doing, I was so grateful for it, because at that point I had been in, you know, men's workspace for quite a bit. And one of my gripes was that there wasn't enough men of color in the spaces that I was in, at least. And for me, my experience of being in the Black King Circle was it just allowed for deeper layers of vulnerability and conversations that I just couldn't have with people that wouldn't understand what it's like to be a Black man in America, and what it's like to, you know, think about what you look like, right, when you step outside of the house, or when you're driving your car, or, you know, all the other nuanced things that are part of our experience and stories. So I want to thank you for creating that space. And, you know, I also want to ask you for, you know, young Black men of color out there that might be dealing with that sense of insecurity, self-worth and confidence. And, you know, what I think of is like all those things, what they limit the most is our audacity to ask for what we need, right? Because if you don't think you're worth it, then you're not going to ask for what you need. So, you know, for any man out there that's dealing with that, you know, what would you recommend them do in order to, help heal that part of themselves?
That's a tough question. Let me feel into it. What's coming up is something I want to bring up around the topic, which is forgiveness. So I'm just going to kind of riff here. In general, I would say, you know, Black men, Black people who have suffered oppression, you know, there's generally like an anger or resentment towards the oppressor for what was done or what is being done. And in my experience, like being stuck in anger, you know, anger is a perfectly valid emotion. It has its time and place, but when we're stuck in it, it becomes counterproductive because we can't move through it to what's deeper. And generally below anger is grief, you know, for having been wronged. And that grief, in my experience, that's reflective of the trauma itself. Like the pain of the trauma creates this feeling of grief. But because the pain is so great, we're not able to touch it. But a kind of a layer around it is this anger, right? So we get angry, we want to fight, you know? And so for me, like the most powerful thing I was able to do that unlocked me from feeling like a victim, because I think that's kind of like what we're alluding to, is like feeling like a victim, is being able to forgive my oppressors. Now, the way I was able to do that is by creating what I call an empathy bridge. Basically, I was able to, and this happened, it took time and lots of meditation and really like deep self-reflection and understanding like why do people really, forget about race, why do people hurt other people, right? Why do we act that way? And it took me back to, you know, and I read some books and things like that, and realizing that, you know, a lot of the colonizers, you know, taking it back that far, they would leave the place they were to go some other place and start oppressing, you know, indigenous people. But what they were doing largely was treating those indigenous people the same way they were being treated where they came from. So like a lot of times those people came from really harsh environments where they were treated really poorly. And that, when I realized that, that's what helped me understand why, you know, oppressors oppress the oppressed, you know, why white people treated people of color that way, to say it that way. And it basically, it kind of goes back to hurt people, you know, people who are hurt other people. They project that hurt onto others. When I understood that, it opened my eyes to be able to see the humanity of my oppressor, if that makes sense, and actually have empathy for them as a hurt human being, because I was a hurt human being. You know, I could relate to them that way. And I know that when I'm hurt, sometimes I project that hurt into other people, right? That's like getting stuck in the anger, you know, you want to lash it out. And so when I realized that, and I made that connection, that kind of called that empathy bridge, when I realized that hurt people, I was able to see the humanity of them and actually reach a level of forgiveness, because I understood more deeply where they were coming from and how they could treat me or my family or my ancestors or my people or any people that way. And for me, being able to forgive, I guess it like unlocked like my feeling of victimhood or anger, resentment. I was able to, everything just kind of unlocked, and I was just able to sit in the grief of humans are just kind of messy, hurt, you know, imperfect beings. We're all learning. And I think the level deeper is like, there's a level of innocence, of unconsciousness or innocence in that action. Because, you know, and this may be debatable, I don't know, but, you know, generally when we hurt someone, there's a level of unconsciousness that we're acting from. And because it's unconscious, there's a level of innocence, right? And so that's what allows me to see the humanity in that person that's behaving a bad way. So I don't know if this answers your question, but it's kind of like, it's what's coming up, you know, on the topic. And I do think it's an important point though, because for me, learning how to forgive people who have hurt me has been the most empowering thing I can do for myself, to no longer feel like a victim.
I think it's a great answer, man. I love the empathy bridge, and I also love the validating the anger and resentment that's felt, and also having that willingness to go deeper to the underlying layer, which grief, which I totally agree with, and that how those allow for forgiveness. I also think, you know, what you laid out is what I see ancestral healing being, exactly. Whether that's colonizers and what has been done by other people to your ancestors, or things that have occurred in your own lineage, being able to see the humanity in those that have wronged us or wronged those that we love, doesn't make what they did okay, right, but it enables us to, I guess, reclaim power, you know, is really what I'm seeing. Yeah. Reclaiming that power and just being choiceful about how we want to then move forward, as opposed to this reactionary pattern that's really just repeating the pattern that's been done before, even if it's something that we despise, something that we're very angry about. It's really easy to just recreate that if we don't get to that sense of understanding our grief around it.
Yeah. A feeling of spaciousness.
Yeah. It's been a big process for me as well, man. And I think that I think there's levels and layers to forgiveness, and I know for me, I've forgiven in the past, and this could just be my wife. This could be, someone that's done something really bad to me. It could be, slavery and all that. I've forgiven things in the past in a sense to just like get past it. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Or to be able, almost like that, forgive and forget is what comes up for me. It's mm-hmm. less forgiveness, more just wanting to forget about it so that I can move on. And it seems like those things will always end up coming up if it's not been addressed, healed, and truly forgiven.
Yeah, we forgive for ourselves. It's not for the other person or the other group of people. Mm-hmm. It's see if I can like touch this. My experience is the forgiveness allowed me to let go of it. It's kind of like I was holding on to this pain in a righteous way. Like, you wronged me. I feel pain. It's your fault. But when I was able to forgive them, I'm not religious, but the Jesus Christ quote, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. That's one of the most powerful, profound quotes for me personally, because you imagine this man being crucified, saying those words. I think that's when he said it, saying those words, being actively crucified. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. That is compassion. That is recognizing that the people who are harming you are acting from unconsciousness. For the most part, there are psychotic people, sociopaths who do it for pleasure. I think that's, not the case we're talking about. Like, generally, people are acting from unconsciousness. They don't actually know what they're doing. I believe that in a very deep level. And when I'm able to really believe that and know that in my body, it's like, that righteousness that makes me want to hold on to my pain because they wronged me, it just dissolves into just the truth, which it's just unconsciousness. That's what unconsciousness does. Sometimes unconsciousness hurts because it doesn't actually know the truth. It's acting out of its own pain and projecting that out instead of it healing its pain, So for me, like you said, you mentioned perpetuating the pattern or breaking the pattern, right? My goal is to no longer perpetuate harm. Like, this is kind of coming to me right now, but like, I do my best to take responsibility for my pain and own it and heal it. And that essentially creates a new cycle, but it's really tough work. It's really, challenging to do that completely.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I hear that, taking responsibility for our own pain, one thing that comes up for me, and forgiveness as well, kind of all these things, is like spiritual bypassing, right? Bypassing. And I guess, where does that fit into the conversation, and how do you know the difference between authentically healing and addressing, the wounds that we all have, forgiving others, and where does bypassing fit into the conversation, and how do we know when that's something we're doing?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I think for me, bypassing happens when we aren't present with what's really coming up with us or within us. Right. So generally, bypassing happens because something happens and it evokes pain, but the pain is too great for us to be with. So instead of us feeling it, we kind of rebound from it, maybe at the anger level or something, or the fear level, and we reject something out. We take some outward action, right? We bypass the truth, which is what we're really feeling, which is really painful. And so for me, how to get over, or how to not bypass, it requires feeling, like learning how to feel what's in your body, which it's a lifelong task, probably. Like for me, like long meditations for years now is really what has allowed me to go deeper into my body. And that's the embodiment aspect of it, like the long tail I mentioned. And the more I go into my body, the more I could feel, the more capacity I have to be with life. Right. So then the less bypassing I do. That's like my experience with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. It kind of always just circles back to the ability to go within and be honest and integral about what's actually happening inside of there. And, honest and integral with it. And also just developing the practice of slowing down and quieting down enough that we can actually listen to what's going on within, because, there's a lot of external stimulus that's jockeying for our attention. And the more we focus on that, the less we can actually pay attention and hear what's going on within.
Yeah, I think that's where, for me, meditation has been incredibly helpful. Like when I first started, I could barely sit for 15 minutes. I was still working at my company. I did the Vipassana, I went home, and like my goal was 15 minutes a day. And I was squirming by like minute 10. Like it was hard. But over time, over years, I learned how to expand my capacity and sit for longer stretches. And I found that when I sit for longer stretches, 1, 2 hours, 3, 4 hours, it's pretty common these days. Sometimes like my longest is like 11 hours. Like when I can just sit still for that period long of time and focus and go into my body, then that's what's been helpful for me to be able to expand my capacity to be with all the things that come up. But it requires taking that time. Like you have to set that time aside. And that's what's challenging for a lot of people, I think, is to actually make that time for themselves.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's like, it's like any skill or a muscle, right? In order to get better at it, you have to train it. And I think we only allocate time to things that we see as profitable in a way.
Yeah.
If it doesn't have value, then I'm not going to create the time for it. And I think sometimes it's hard to see the value in sitting still for 15 minutes and going within. Yeah. And I always love talking to you about these sorts of things, because I think you have a great capacity to go high, like very ethereal, and also go very low, like rooted and grounded. And I think when, at least for me as a man, when I can see both of those things, it becomes more enticing. It becomes more valuable. It becomes worth waking up 20 minutes early so I can sit for 15 minutes. So I really love how you're able to share about those things and how they've impacted you in real time.
Yeah, thank you.
So the last thing I want to talk about, because there's so many more things to talk about, but maybe we'll have to do an episode 2. I want to talk about your art. You mentioned it before. You talked about activated art, and I know this is something that kind of came along with going to Burning Man, taking space from startup world, and kind of coincides with your spiritual awakening. So. Let's talk about art a little bit. Again, creation, I think, is something that's innate in all of us and super important for us to do as humans. However, especially as men, I know we can put less value on art and creation because we need to survive, right? And if it's not making us money, then why am I going to make time for it? I have bill A, B, and C to pay for and take care of. So tell me your history with art. Is it something that you've always loved and been doing? And then tell me how, a little bit more about activated art and how that's like blossomed for you.
Sure. Yeah. I've always been artistic, creative, my whole life. It's in my family, it's in my blood. But when I would create at MIT, I enjoyed my time there working in the machine shops and everything. But when I started building the company, was in California in my 20s, I pretty much put my whole creative side to the side to focus on money, building the company, like you're saying. And it wasn't until, after I left the company about 6 months later that I got the inspiration for the sculpture. And then the next year I started making the mandalas, the activated art. But it wasn't until 2018, 3 years after I left the company, before I was about to go back to work, that what happened was I was meditating and I went deep and I felt the pain of not allowing that side of myself out for so long. And it was devastating pain. I was crying. Like it was such deep pain for having essentially cut that side of myself off for, call it a decade, or so, something like that, 8 years. And it was when I realized that I was like, wow, like I can't for any longer not let my artistic side out. Like I have to do this. And that was like 2 months before I was going to go back to work. Right. So I was like about to go back into the grinder, but like, I was like, I had to do it. And so I did, I created activated art or I kind of revamped it, but, did a Kickstarter, raised $30,000 to build these laser cut mandalas. And that coincided with starting my new job. So I was busy, but I was passionate and fueled because I was doing what I was meant to do, or at least opening that part of myself up. And so it's kind of connected with the spiritual aspect of it is, my art has been, it's my understanding of it now, it really is a gift to the world. Like at first my ego wanted to make it a business. I don't want to make a bunch of money from it and all that stuff. And it very quickly taught me that that's not what it wants. My art it's really beautiful. It's like almost like it's like this sentient creature, this being that I'm co-collaborating, co-creating with. And like, if I get out of alignment, then it will like slap my wrist and be like, no, that's not right. One way or another, something will happen that will go wrong. And like, okay, that wasn't right. That was my ego coming in, trying to co-opt this for its own gain. And so like, I've really learned how to surrender my own needs or desires to the creative process to allow myself to be a channel for this art, this expression to come through and be a gift for the world. I really experienced that with the sculpture I built for Burning Man, but also similarly with the activated art mandalas that I create now. So now my focus is I just create when I'm inspired to create. And I do sell them. They're on my website, but I don't like push it or market it or anything. Like if people want to see it and they want to buy it, great. If not, that's cool too. It's really just, this is my gift and I love to give it.
I love that visual of channeling. Both of us are members of the Native American Church, and one analogy that's used is that we want to be like that eagle bone whistle that's hollow and just harnessing the voice, the harnessing creation and creator, right?
Yep.
And really, I feel like art is like, at least for me and my experiences, is probably the purest way to do that, and I think you hear musicians, painters, any medium, people express that in different ways, but essentially it's like channeling the unseen and putting it into the physical realm. And essentially it's like, this is a way we want to be in all areas and aspects of our life. And it's not an easy thing to do, but art is such a excellent way to practice that way of being and then be able to expand that out into the different areas and domains of your life.
Yeah. I think when you said like, this is how we want to be in all of life, I think that's spot on. Like to be that channel for spirit to flow through moment to moment, I think that is like, if I call it a goal, like, that's an intention of mine to be able to be that moment to moment. But my art has definitely taught me in real time, that's true, that it's not about us. It's not about me, like art or life. It's more about how can I be of service to this greater purpose or maybe to rephrase it is, how can I open up to the opportunity to be of service to the greater purpose that wants to live through me, but is blocked by my own trauma, conditioning, ego, that kind of things. Right. So it's like my work is to clear myself out, which is like my primary focus in life right now, is clearing myself out in my body, my energy body, emotional body, all kind of stuff. So I can be of greatest service to the greater purpose that I know is like knocking on the door to live through me,
I think that is, that's ancestral healing, personal development, and, self-work. That is the purpose of it. And I think you just articulated it. Couldn't say it any better. It's like identifying the blockages, removing them and getting out of our own way so we can, channel some higher source for the sake of being of service to our brothers and sisters.
Yep.
Being of service to our communities.
Yeah.
Well said, man. I think that's we can tie it up with a bow right there. Man, there's so many more things that I wanted to talk about, but we're going to do a number 2.
Yeah, let's do number 2.
We're going to dedicate a whole thing to reality transfer.
Yes.
It's a book that you put me onto that's been blowing my mind. So
Awesome.
I really would love to have a longer conversation about that one.
Look forward to it. I love that too.
Awesome. So before we hop off here, Jeremy, is there any final words, anything that's like there present within you that you want to leave the listeners with?
Nothing really. It's just, I just want to say thank you, to you and Jetty. And I really have such deep respect for you, both of you, and the Rising Man movement and the impact that you're having on the world, on these men. I've been fortunate enough to be part of the community for over 2 years now, I think. And it's one of the most important parts of my life. So I just wanted to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on this platform, and for you guys for doing this great work.
Really appreciate those words, man. It means a lot coming from you.
Awesome.
Last but not least, big yourself up. If people want to reach out to you, if they want to see your artwork, anything you want to talk about or promote.
Sure. My website, my personal website is jrich.io. My art is activated-art.com. So yeah, those are the places people can see my work and what I'm up to.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you again for making time for this conversation. I really appreciate all the beautiful words that you dropped here, and always love being in conversation with you, man.
All right. Thanks, man. It was a great time.
Much love. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. You too.